Testing 2. 1, 2.
Live stream offline. Offline. Give it some time, I suppose.
It is on that.
Yeah, here we go. So, yeah, it's, what is this? This is old. Oh, this is the old one. I think it's offline.
No, I think you need to delete the old stream, as you remember yesterday when we were testing it.
Good point.
So there's two now, isn't there? There's
Yes.
two uploads.
Yes, let's go.
So
Okay.
what does that mean?
Let's go and delete the previous stream. But if we delete the previous stream, the link changes. The link changes.
So it's live. It's live. One person's watching.
So let's leave it live.
So, wait, is that...
Yeah, now it's working.
Is that full screen?
Full screen.
Leave it live.
And it's pretty good.
What's the pretty bad.
Okay, let me just... Okay, testing. We're testing this. No, that was good. That was good. I'd rather have...
But if we delete the previous stream, the link changes. The link changes. So it's live. It's live. One person watching. So let's leave it live. Wait, is that... Now it's working. Yeah, it's full screen. Leave it live. And it's pretty good. Okay, let me just... Okay, testing. Testing this. Okay, amazing.
We'll just leave it.
Good.
What?
Yes, one of the speakers just contacted me. I'll be right back.
Fine.
society been on?
This is the founder of the
2
society.
years,
2 years.
relatively, or very young.
Why did you want to? Because you'd think that this would be almost more for people who wanted to follow pharmacy as a career as opposed to
Absolutely.
medicine.
Yeah, so it was myself and a friend of mine, and at that point, we both were, but particularly he was interested in pharma, so
As a
he's,
career.
and he's a medic, yeah. So we set it up as an Imperial College rather than ICSM society, so that it could remain open to those from other degrees who.
Do you need
Okay.
to have a medical degree to be a pharmacist here?
No, I don't think so. Not sure.
Okay, sure. Okay, should we start? Great. Okay, so welcome to this debate about the use of animal testing in research. Thanks to our online audience for watching it and streaming it at home. So basically, today will be a discussion about the use of animal testing in research, and the central motion will be this House would ban all animal testing in research. And this is basically Imperial's contribution to a nationwide discussion on this topic. So this debate is being carried out in lots of universities across the country. And as you can see, it's being hosted by Imperial College Pharmacology Society, which is a student-run society which mainly provides pharmacology teaching for medical students, which is a topic that many find difficult, but we also do organise events like this. So please keep a lookout in the future. And we're also organising this event in conjunction with IDEA UK, which is an organisation that promotes debating amongst young people across the country. So the format of this debate will be guided by questions which have been submitted to us, mainly from Imperial students. So I will act as the overseer, and I will direct questions either to the whole panel or just to individual members if I deem them suitable. And then we've got a couple of questions at the end as well. So to introduce my panel, so I've got Tom MacKinnon, medical student at Imperial College, and he was actually one of the founding members of this Pharmacology Society. Then I've got Dimitrios Karponis, a third-year medical student and the current president of Pharmacology Society. Then I've got Alexia Simonnard-Note, who is a first-year grad medical student and also has a previous experience working in a pharmaceutical company. And then to my immediate right, I've got Uddhav Vaghela, another third-year medical student who has a wealth of research experience, and so do the rest of my panel actually. So I will start with the questions. So the first question will be for the whole panel, so I'll just go individually one by one, and it is, what is your personal experience in the field of animal research? So Tom, do you want to start?
So me personally, I'm in my 5th year of my medical degree at the moment, my studies, and I have to say, in terms of experience, direct experience with animal research is very little. Having said that, I find it a very interesting topic and I've read around it. From my perspective, I think in the medical setting, I think animal testing is justified if it is well regulated and if the need for a drug or a treatment is such that it's justifiable to use animals in order to prevent harm coming to humans. I think I definitely can understand both sides of the argument. I think that putting animals through unnecessary suffering obviously is wrong. Sorry, I'm straying a little bit, but in terms of my personal experience, very little. But I do, even just reading papers during our training, critically appraising papers. So many of these studies you read which involve clinical trials of novel drugs or even repurposing of drugs or things like that. There's so much that's gone on behind the scenes with animal testing and safety testing using animal studies, which I think we sometimes underestimate. So I think it's important to bear that in mind.
I do think animal research, when justified for the right reasons, should also be appropriate. And for the betterment of human health, that's usually a reason in which we support animal research for, because it does more harm than good. Now, I'm sure we'll discuss more about this in a little bit. In terms of personal experience, I think it's a very good example to think about who does the research with the animal, because in different countries, different regulations are in place. So you may find laboratories which are very strict. For example, at Imperial College, students cannot work with live animals on their own. Someone with a house office license needs to be there with them. And from my personal experience, when we performed operations on live animals, for example, live imaging, and the animal had to be asleep, we were working with a mouse, and the mouse eyes were open. Of course, as you can understand, that would have caused dryness, and that could have been difficult for the mouse later on. However, the researchers took that into account, and we were using a special cream for the eyes of that mouse in order to avoid dryness. That's one example. You get different examples at the other end of the spectrum in some other countries where the regulations aren't as strict. So maybe these give rise to a bigger debate. But overall, I think animal research is justified for the right reasons.
So in terms of my personal experience with animal research, the company I worked for used animal testing to approve of drugs. It was in France, so according to French pharmacological regulations. And it was an integral part of getting a drug passed, or getting a drug renewed, or maintaining a drug on the market if the regulations changed to have to prove additional levels of safety. In terms of my position on it, suffering is never something that anyone, I think, wants to do on another creature easily, or even willingly, but I don't really see an alternative for proving the safety of a medical drug, aside from using animals. Once you've done all the in vitro testing possible, there's a point where you need an in vivo test. And the question is, would you rather just do it on humans straight immediately, or would you rather go through the animal side of things before doing it on humans? And I think that, as you were saying, there's a lot of times where the animal testing has proven and kept the drug, and so there's been a lot of screening thanks to the animal testing, by contrast, where a lot of drugs have not made it to market because they've been caught at the animal testing level. And when you see that there's still cases where drugs, I mean, I just remember thalidomide is the first one that comes to mind, but there's still cases where drugs have absolutely drastic effects, and they weren't caught despite the testing, despite that. Now, that could be an argument saying, well, then what's the point of animal testing? But you have to imagine, for every one drug that gets through the cracks, how many drugs were caught and prevented massive morbidities. So I don't really see a viable alternative to this.
So, in terms of my experience, I've had no experience with animals in the context of pharmaceuticals, or indeed the general medical research, but I have had interaction with insect models, and specifically in the context of malaria. So that, I think, is a different debate altogether. But in terms of my stance with regards to animal testing, I think there are very convincing arguments as to why it should be used in terms of betterment to medicine and human health. But ultimately, I think at this stage in the advances which we've developed in medical technology and ways in which to test efficacy and safety, there are alternatives which we are perhaps underexploiting, and perhaps our use of animal modelling is perhaps antiquated. People are quite set in stone with the way in which they're conducting research. I think we'll come on to this as the discussion progresses, but you mentioned testing the safety and toxicity of medications with animals, and how it has that ability to preempt morbidity when it comes to market. But in reality, a vast majority of drugs are not truly the simulation of the effect of the drug is not true in animals, and there are sheer differences in terms of the animal physiology, the animal genetics, which means that really animal modelling has a lot of flaws in it. So my stance is that there are alternatives and they should be explored.
Okay, thank you. So the second part of that question involves whether you are satisfied with the current regulations with regards to the use of animals in research. So before we move on to that question, would you mind telling me a bit more about what the current regulations actually are? Alexia.
So I will actually express lack of knowledge because I have no idea what the current regulations in the UK are.
Okay.
In France, the regulations are just to limit the amount of pain and suffering that the animal goes through. And also there's a lot of regulation in terms of the type of drug you're testing and what animal model is the most appropriate. So the company that I worked for did a lot of gastrointestinal, and so we used a lot of pigs because their digestive system was the most similar to human digestive systems. And if we'd used other cheaper animals like rats or rabbits, that would have not been in according to regulation. But I do confess that was an aspect of it that I had not been well versed in.
But in terms of France, how did you find the regulations there? Are you satisfied with them?
Yeah, I mean it's done to help to try to prevent as much animal suffering as possible while still obtaining an effective result.
Yeah, Dimitri?
I think regulations, as I said before, are different from country to country. Myself, I'm not aware of the UK regulations either, but there are some commonalities, I suppose, in many countries. So, for example, as Alexia mentioned, it is very important to minimize the suffering, no matter what type of animal we're using, or class of animal we're using, either that's a rodent or if that's a mosquito. Another thing is we should consider alternatives before we go on to animal testing. Make sure we're at the right stage to animal test. Make sure that we've screened appropriately and that we've done the in vivo tests so that we don't test animals in vain when they don't need to be tested. And another thing I suppose would be, which is in some countries but probably not others, would be to minimize the amount of animals tested. Use the least possible amount, which would still give you a safe and reproducible result.
I think just going on from that, so I think one of the mantras that I read about that those involved with animal testing work by is the 3 R's. So I'm sure you may well have heard of them. So it's reduce, refine, replace. So where possible, reduce the amount of the level of invasiveness, the amount of suffering that you're going to impose on the animal, refine your techniques to achieve a similar goal, and where possible, replace animal testing and the need for animal testing by using alternative methods. With regards to the UK laws and regulations in place for animal testing, my understanding is that the UK actually has one of the most strict laws in place. I think there was an animal testing act passed in the late 20th century, which went above and beyond the European requirements, and puts in place various protective laws within it to ensure that suffering is minimised for these animals. And actually, as a result of that, from speaking with others, if you want to begin or carry out a trial that involves animals here, I think even as Imperial as an example, you have to produce and provide pros and cons essentially of doing the research, risks to the animal, other alternatives. You need to have shown that you've thought through all of this, and then at the end, I think a panel then decides whether you should go ahead or you should be allowed to go ahead with that research. So it's very strict in this country. I think the UK and Germany are two of the strictest.
Mhm.
And that's actually, sorry, just one more point to add. One of the risks of completely banning animal studies, animal testing in medicine, is that what might happen is that you then drive animal testing overseas, perhaps outside of the developed world or to the developing world, where there aren't structures in place, legal structures in place to ensure that people follow the rules, that they do genuinely minimise suffering to animals. So there's a risk of, far worse things happening to animals if suddenly tomorrow animal testing was banned here.
If I may jump in, I don't think so.
Okay.
For the simple reason that when you try to, again, I'm just from when we were trying to pass a drug, we had to do a whole series of testing, and depending on the country that tested in, it was more easily or less easily approved.
Okay.
So at one point we had to go to a human phase trial, and it was a lot easier to have it done in Romania than in France. But when we tried to sell that to the government, they basically told us no. Their regulations are not appropriate and according to French regulations, so go ahead and do your study, but it won't count.
Sure.
So that I would find it very hard. Yes, of course, there's always but it's not like outsourcing the fabrication of a car. If you still want the drug to be approved in the UK, it has to be approved according to UK pharmacological regulations and standards. And if the UK says we don't do animal testing, and if you do animal testing in country, it has to be from this list of countries with these approved regulations. I mean, you can block it off. So it does. I don't think it's as easy to relocate and globalize animal testing as it would be for regular manufacturing jobs, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a good point. I suppose if you completely, if there aren't being cars produced in the UK, for example, to use your analogy, then we need cars from somewhere as well, I suppose. So perhaps that by starving the source, it forces you to look elsewhere. I don't know. So I completely agree. I have much less experience than you in the field, but I'm just that was one of the thoughts that I had, that perhaps it might drive it underground almost and make the situation worse.
And with regards to your mention of legislation, sort of contributing to what you guys have said, I think in Europe there's been a paradigm shift in terms of the value, the deemed value of animal testing and whether suffering is acceptable, and that's been reflected in, I think 2 or 3 years ago they introduced a complete ban on all cosmetic drugs that had been developed using animals in terms of determining safety, and that strict regulation shows that there is an appreciation of the fact that animal testing.
There's also a bit of a difference between cosmetics and medicine, in the sense that cosmetics don't necessarily cause life-threatening issues. I'm also far more familiar, I'm intrigued by what you were saying, that there were alternatives to animal testing, because I'm familiar with the concept of alternatives for cosmetics, and so I personally think that that's a very good idea to ban animal testing for cosmetics, because it's needless. But I have not heard of viable, reliable alternatives to animal testing for things such as cancer drugs, or likewise heavy, potentially life-threatening treatments.
So you're doing my job for me, actually.
Sorry.
So the next question, no, that's good. The next question was, what are the alternatives to animal research?
So it's interesting that you mentioned cancer. There was one of the heads for the National Institute for Cancer Research in America stated that we have conducted an extensive amount of research in animal models for cancer, and all of our chemotherapy agents are curing cancer in mice. So we've cured cancer in a mouse model, but it's not translating to humans. So this is where I mentioned that there is a lack of fidelity in terms of translational research when it comes to animal modeling. And in terms of alternatives, a lot of the pharmacokinetics and dynamics that are being assessed using animals are relevant to toxicity and metabolism. And for example, there are in vitro simulations which are essentially using analogs of liver enzyme, like cytochrome P450, and a complex of various other enzymes to simulate the liver in terms of metabolism. And that completely eliminates the need to use animals as the intermediate.
So, Dimitri?
Yes, sure. So a few points here. First of all, regarding animals as models, this is a debate that often comes up because we test many drugs on animals. Many drugs may fail, and some drugs which get approval and come to the market may be seen causing horrendous side effects. Hopefully, this is not very fortunate. This is not very common, but I do believe that animals, or some animals, are very good as models. In fact, ideal for the current stages. For example, taking into consideration mice. With mice, we share in some of our genes more than 99%. So for specific protein expression, in some cases they would be ideal. On the other hand, very common conditions such as atherosclerosis, many humans get that later on in their life. However, mice do not get atherosclerosis on their own. So this is a fundamental difference. But taking into account how relatively easy it is for researchers to set an environment for the animals and manipulate that environment, control the confounding variables and minimize confounding compared to, say, using humans, which I'm sure we'll talk about more later. I think at the moment animal testing would be our best go. Now, in terms of alternatives, there is a lot lined up in the horizon, but I'm afraid at the moment there is not much else that would be able to substitute animals safely and effectively. What's being used, for example, is microdosing. In some cases where you give smaller doses and see what happens. But what I think could be a breakthrough, perhaps, in the future, would be with advancing technology and bioengineering, the use of 3D printed materials, and which could be then more advanced. And instead of materials, we could maybe one day 3D print specific tissues for very accurate representation and in vitro testing.
If I may just interject, there's two things, and kind of bounced off of one of them, but two things that you said that surprised me. I've read a lot, I'm familiar with the articles where repeatedly you cure cancer in mice, it doesn't translate. But I would argue that testing cancer drugs on mice is useless. Because mice, the difference, yes, we've got a lot of genetic similarity with mice, but the amoeba has a bigger genome than we do, and it's the size and comparability of the genetic system does not necessarily translate to physiology. If you told me that that was true, for example, with chimpanzees or rhesus monkeys, then I'd find it a bigger of an issue. But I would challenge, why are we hurting mice, wasting money, wasting resources, and wasting mouse lives, testing cancer on mice when there is a better animal substitute for the human body in terms of cancer? So I think that that is more testament of the lack of appropriate animal model picked than really a case against animal models and animal testing, full stop. And then the second point, so I'm going to say 2 points at the same time. The second point was when you mentioned that you can get enzymes that mimic liver enzymes and whatnot, you're assuming that that drug is only going to target the liver. And it makes me think of a menopause drug that was great at helping prevent menopause and all that, but we didn't know it was hyperactive for breast tissue, and suddenly breast cancer popped up. And then we did another one that fixed that, but then it was hyperactive for uterine tissue, and uterus cancers popped up. And you don't know. The problem is that we're a whole body. We're not just a liver, and you don't know where these things are going to run around.
So that's true. I think that's where researchers need to be more discerning in what it is exactly that they're trying to determine in terms of the property of the drug. So when I was mentioning the liver enzymes, the analogs, that was more in terms of metabolism. So if their focus is to determine the metabolic elements and how the byproducts have an effect systemically, then that's where that will be used. And if, for example, if they want to determine the target effect on ovarian tissue, then that should be their focus. So I agree, we are a system and we have to view it holistically. But I think there is a way in which to target each of these individual elements and then exclude animal models in doing so.
If I may quickly jump in, just a quick point regarding the choice of animal selection. Now this is a good point that sometimes chimpanzees or monkeys may be more ideal than mice. But I think we need to consider the problem of cost effectiveness here. It has been more easy to, let's say, transport mice, not only to use inbred mice. It's also more easy to fit more of them in your laboratory. So I think in terms of cost effectiveness, that's one reason why mice may be preferable to chimpanzees. But then again, when we talk about great breakthroughs such as HIV treatment or some types of hepatitis, when the similarity is big, then the model is appropriate and the betterment for human health is such that we deem that we should go that extra mile, give that extra cost, and test the monkeys. So I think in an ideal world, well, in an ideal world maybe we wouldn't need to test animals, but in an ideal world we would probably not do all these experiments we do on mice.
So what's interesting was I found a statistic, and this has happened very close to where we are hosting this debate. So one of the Imperial College hospitals, Norfolk Park, had a trial using a novel monoclonal antibody, and it was tested over 500 times on monkeys. And so primate model, which we believe to have a lot of similarity to us in terms of physiology and generally speaking. And yet, when it ultimately came into the human studies, a lot of people had severe allergic reactions, which almost proved fatal. So this is again problems in terms of translatability.
Just one quick point, I think this happens. This is unfortunately part of the inevitable side of the gamble, because more or less we are taking a big risk. So, for example, when a pharmaceutical company does that, it is taking a big risk because it is expecting to get its profit from the sales afterwards, after years of testing and years of getting the approval and developing the drug and screening and what have you, and all those other things. But even after such a thorough process, you get that. What I think is, unfortunately, this is a risk of the game. We should be looking at the other side of the table as well. We should be looking at all those drugs that come out and are a success and helped prolong life expectancy, cure everyday problems, and make a life full of morbidity a life sentence and not a death sentence.
Absolutely, and that brings into play the utilitarianism argument, doesn't it? So the utilitarian argument, which argues that the right action is based on whether it maximises good for the most people. And following straight off you, Dimitrios, what you just said, I think it's easy to lose sight of the success stories and focus in really close on the suffering of these animals. But I think if you look at some of the great successes that have resulted from animal testing, so insulin from dog testing, the polio vaccine, and a lot of polio research was done on animals, and many more, vaccinations, drugs, this continues. But I mean, the insulin alone, if you try and quantify the number of lives saved and quality of life improvements there, I think it's it's quite staggering.
So there is an interesting ethical question when it comes to animal research. So the fact that animals are tested on before humans usually, or all the time, implies that there's some sort of, the rights of animals are secondary to those of humans. So what basis does that have? Why do we just assume that the rights of animals are secondary to us?
Do we?
By testing on them first.
We also eat them.
Yes, exactly.
Does that mean that I mean, if I go out in Africa, I might get eaten by a lion. So does a lion think that I am secondary in my rights of the world than he does? It's a food chain thing. We have, I mean, I don't necessarily see how it's saying that they are lesser beings than, in terms of ethics, than us by using them in animal testing. Ethics is fairly a human construct. I don't really think it exists in the animal kingdom. You have kind of a code of conduct where you see that animals in terms of a pack or a society will help each other out. But beyond that, it's if we can eat them, why can't we use them for other purposes?
I agree, completely agree, and I think animal rights is a topic which is quite obscure. Now, that by no means implies that animals do not have rights. They are living beings, but their rights are quite untenable in the sense that what if we treat them like we treat humans in terms of rights? So, in the animal kingdom, animals eat each other every day. Would we convict or would we imprison a lion for killing and eating another animal? So I think it's a thin line that we need to think of, and also in terms of this question as to why do we start with animals as a front line and not humans in terms of testing? Why do we test first on animals? I quite think that it is sort of a dominion thing that we have developed through the ages in terms of evolution. So humans have evolved by, as Alexia said, hunting and eating animals, using them for other purposes, using their fur to protect them from the cold, and so on and so forth. So it seems only reasonable to the society to use them for another purpose, to improve their health and increase their lifespan.
And I would question why, if we consider it appropriate to do testing on animals, then why do we not consider testing humans who are willing? So every day we have a multitude of trials which have very little in terms of evidence base, and they're promoted in the tube, in various portals, offering financial incentives and various incentives to actually recruit people on these trials. And these are people who are unaware of the side effects and the detriment it could potentially have. And yet we recruit these people for testing. So why do we not completely bypass the animal modeling stage and just use willing humans and consent with appropriate consent?
Well, I imagine we do.
But then I'm asking.
Just take out the animal testing step. Just go straight
So
from
if we
the
go
in vitro to the in vivo
Exactly.
human model.
I think there's several answers to that. First of all, there's numbers. I don't think you could ever get enough volunteers to really gain a powerful enough study for any drug. Number two, I think there are studies which you mentioned where they advertise for young healthy volunteers with asthma, for example. Often the drugs or the intervention that they're testing has been
A degree of validation.
exactly, and there's a minimal risk profile associated with it. And I think for other more novel drugs that may have a really destructive side effect profile, I think how could you ever consent someone who, I mean, if you properly consented someone to go to join a trial for a monoclonal antibody drug that could potentially have life-threatening side effects, I think again, that comes back to, I don't know if you'd find enough numbers of people who'd be willing to do that. And thirdly, one of the key advantages of animal testing, as I think you touched on this earlier, Dimitrios, is your ability to remove variable factors and confounders. The fact that we can breed mice, for example, who are genetically identical to each other, and they grow up together in cages next to each other, identical cages, fed the exact same amount of food, and therefore you can test drugs on them, you can test interventions on them, and you know that there are no other variables at play. Whereas if you gave a drug to someone who's grown up on the streets of New York versus someone who's grown up in the slums of Rio, I think we may not realise it, but I think there's so many variables in terms of how each of their bodies would respond to the drug, that it's also with ethnicity as well, that it's not viable, in my opinion.
I think the species difference is more significant than the minor discrepancies we have in ethnicity, or indeed the environmental stresses.
Yeah.
You're going to have to test it on humans at some point anyway.
Exactly, but like we said earlier, what you do by testing on animals is you filter out all of those which are likely to be unsuccessful.
You also filter out the ones that are highly unsuccessful in animals and could be successful in humans. Because if a false positive exists, so does a false negative.
I'm sure you can. Yeah.
So how many therapies have we potentially missed out on because all the mice died?
That's a great question. Yeah, and that's one of the counter arguments, isn't it?
That is a good point, but following on from Tom's case, with which I completely agree, another risk that we run, and it is a big risk if we remove that step of animal testing, is that of the population that we will be recruited for the trials, the participants. What I mean is that there have been examples in the past where drugs have been tested in prisoners, or where Eli Lilly was recruiting homeless people for their trials because of the financial incentives. So I am thinking, of course this can only be hypothetical, but if we remove the animal testing step and we give this very unsafe drug to a number of participants, apart from the people who desperately need it and see it as the last dim of hope, we would get more of those people who actually don't need it but come for the financial incentive, and we'd get into another deeper ethical argument.
Okay, and we've touched on this before, but we've established that animal testing for cosmetic products is banned in the UK quite strictly, and it's banned across most of the EU. So why is animal testing banned for the use of cosmetic products but not medical research?
It's two different can of worms. I mean, one can kill. The worst you can get, the absolute worst you can get from a cosmetic product is a mascara that creates an absolutely horrific allergic reaction that will cause blindness. It's the worst thing I can think of, which is it's pretty bad. I'll give you on the scheme of things that could be very extreme and that could be very bad. But you take from that to completely shutting down somebody's kidneys or liver, where they need an emergency organ transplant, otherwise they die, or just killing them straight up. You have a difference.
Okay.
That's on one side. On the other side, we've developed human models to test these various cosmetics that have kind of lived up to the ethical standards of all these countries, which have high ethical standards for human rights. And there have been no issues, at least on that I've heard of. We have not, I still hold this, I know you've brought up alternatives, but I don't see that we've brought up viable, effective, cost-effective alternatives to do that for medical.
I think the underlying motivation for the two industries is very different. One is tapping into the vanity element, and one arguably is very much therapeutics and movie rich.
Okay, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because technically a cosmetic substance includes things that you apply to your body to clean your body. So it includes soap and toothpaste. So do you believe that taps into the vanity aspect? Soap and toothpaste, do you think? Surely they're basic fundamentals of hygiene. Yeah.
What about human dignity with people who've got scars?
Yeah.
They need makeup to-
psychological
Exactly.
aspect as well.
So there's still the fact that it's very hard to die from toothpaste. I mean, I just, unless you put it with heavy metals, but you'd figure that out before you even got to the animal testing, that it's laced with heavy metals.
Okay.
Like I don't see a moment where, because they're not going into our body, I don't see a point where you can't figure out that they're going to cause noxious harm before you need to animal test it.
So when you mean into your body, do you mean into the systemic circulation?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, fine.
I think it's a thin line as well, and I agree that it's a different industry, cosmetics from pharma. Not necessarily maybe because of the people that are targeted, but probably because of the aim of the product. However, the counter argument to this is thinking about people who are really self-aware and may have confidence issues and would like to change their skin or their face or how they look for whatever reason, something which we may not perceive as an actual good reason, but for them it may mean the world. So from that aspect, we want to have safe products for them as well. But then again, there are plenty of examples, and I don't want to mention companies' names in order to make sure that we're not advertising anyone here. But just for instance, La Prairie has for long been experimenting in vitro, producing safe, widely accessible and high quality products without using animals at all.
Very high quality.
So this is a slight tangent, but how comes animal testing is banned for the use of cosmetic products, but we happily use it to produce car seats, to produce handbags, to produce the wallets in my pocket?
We use animal testing to produce car seats.
Well, we use animals to make for leather.
Because you believe that the animal's killed ethically. Animal testing involves keeping an animal alive and putting them through something that could cause suffering.
Okay.
Food and leather products and these things, you'd hope and assume that the animal's killed in an ethical, quick manner.
Okay.
That said, though, there is the question. There are a lot of religions that refuse animal suffering, or prolonged animal pain, or if the animal has to be put down, it has to be done within a certain specific way. And I don't know if it's ever been explored if those religions, because of the tenets, if someone is that religious, can they, are they even given the option of refusing treatment if a drug has been proven to have been used for animal testing in a way that goes against their religious beliefs? I don't think that's brought up ever in a hospital. Because we bring up gelatin for Muslims and Jews, and we have non-pig-based gelatin for pills, and we let them know. But in Judaism, an animal has to be killed a very specific way. In Islam as well, it's halal and kosher. And when you do animal testing, very often you have to kill the animal at the end. And I don't know if it's killed in the same halal or kosher way as it would be for meat, but we never mention that.
It's a really interesting point. I've heard of patients refusing drugs because of their alcohol content, but not ever before.
I don't even know if people are even
the
made aware of it.
means to actually having the drug.
Yeah.
Interesting point. I think logistically, how feasible is it? How interested would the pharmaceutical industry be in
Well, it's
adhering
not.
to
It would remove clients. But I mean, it would cause problems. What it would also do is it would force even more regulation. And because the government then would have to enact regulation, just like it did for the gelatin. Either you lose clients, patients, because they boycott your product, and so the doctors are forced to find an alternative, and you lose sales, or the government, and then you have an economic pressure, or you've got a regulatory pressure where the government says, okay, well, we need to enact a substitute. Either way, I unfortunately do not see the interest of a pharmaceutical company coming up with this and saying hi.
And I question, it depends entirely on the patient and how adherent they are to their religious principles. But when it comes to potentially a life, saving a life extending drug, how interested would they be in terms of the origins of the drug? Does that dwindle into insignificance?
I mean, you do have some people who will take worms off the street and put them into grass just because they believe in never, taking a single life. So that is, some people do believe in I guess the opposite of utilitarianism, that no life is worth theirs, no life is worth more than theirs. So
I think this is a very good point that's been brought up, and if I were to be very, very optimistic, maybe in the future, with the help of technology and what we would call personalized medicine, we can personalize medicine from the very early on of the production of the drug, so that we make sure that the drug is appropriate for not only the patient's body, but also the patient's belief and the patient's background. Now, just to slightly go back to the initial question, which was why would we use animals for our car seats, but we would not for research? Again, I suppose this varies from place to place. You may have farms in which the standards, not because of a strict regulator, but because of the morals of the farmer, the animals there may be bred in an excellent way, and they may be treated better than in a laboratory. But I've read several articles in which describe really distraughting cases in an abattoir, where animals are essentially treated according to Cartesian principles, where they are these machines that need to operate on the maximum level. Let's say chickens produce as many eggs as possible, cows produce as much milk as possible, and they're incapable of feeling pain. So they may be subdued to different operations without anesthesia. Now, of course, there are regulators in this industry as well, but I am not aware if they are as strictly regulated as pharma companies in the UK.
And I think fundamentally one of the reasons why we impose these attitudes on animals comes down to, I think it's undeniable that we, as humans, Homo sapiens, consider ourselves as superior species to the animals. We test into the animals. We eat on a daily basis the animals that provide the leather for the car seats, and I think that's an undeniable element of what drives and allows a lot of research and the way in which animals are treated to happen as it is. You don't seem to be convinced.
no, because I happily eat meat and I happily wear leather, and I don't consider myself superior to an animal.
Would you eat battery farmed chicken?
No,
Is battery farming outlawed?
I don't know,
No.
but I definitely try to pick my meats and I mean, it's an ethical, but as you say, it's an ethical thing. I feel like when you're bringing up those stories, I've heard of them as well, and the more I hear about them, the more I try to be as selective as possible in the type of meat and where my meat is sourced and how it is sourced and all these things, because it's frankly distressing to think about how people can treat other live creatures. And I think you could perfectly acknowledge and have respect and acknowledge them as another living, breathing creature that has just as much right to be on this planet as you do, and not have to become a vegan.
But I think, would you still, as humans, we value our lives above theirs. So I heard someone put it this way, that if this room's filled with people and we were throwing a rat around, our instinct is, that's not right naturally, and you'd be, very wary of what you're doing. But if someone changed that and you're throwing a human baby around, you'd be so much more careful, because a human life ultimately,
it's enshrined. It has certain sort of values.
Exactly. Is that what you're trying to say?
So I think that's exactly what I'm trying to imply.
So why is human life valued more than animal life?
Survival of the species?
That's a good question. Yes, that's also a good answer. I don't know in terms of religion and how many people would agree with the Book of Genesis, for example, but in there it states that God created humans to have a dominance in the face of earth, over fish in the sea, fowl of the air, and so on and so
To
forth.
be the dominions, yeah.
Yes, so that's also one point. But I don't know if we should be discussing about intelligence on this level. This is another debate. Are we the more intelligent species? And if we are, should we consider this a good enough argument for our dominion, or should we focus it more on the sort of human consciousness to carry out this utilitarian consensus?
I think in that sense, you're going down, there's two routes that you can take. You can either go down the route whereby all different species were on a spectrum of levels of intelligence, cognition, whether they're sentient creatures or not, and that is a spectrum. I think we can all agree with that. The other route is more binary. It's, can this species or can this individual animal suffer, yes or no? And I think based on which route you take and which argument you use, I think for those who are against animal suffering, I think often, correct me if I'm wrong, would they be more likely to take the suffering yes or no argument? Because if you take the spectrum of intelligence and awareness, do you think that all species below humans are free game for animal testing? Or do you think, was it the greater apes, chimpanzees, should they be exempt with us? I think at the moment, the only countries allowed to test on chimpanzees are the US and Gabon. At the moment.
That's interesting. So they've drawn the line.
But I
Where they're allowed
think
to.
even in that
Everyone
spectrum,
else has drawn the line. Maybe.
Yeah.
even in that spectrum, you're mentioning cognition, intelligence, but putting those aside, we're talking about suffering, pain, and I think that is binary and doesn't really have a spectrum. I think.
Exactly.
So,
But what if people think that animals don't feel pain? Do you think a mosquito feels pain? Living creature.
We do
What is
have,
part of the animal kingdom? Taxon.
Is that-
Kingdom Animalia versus Kingdom.
insects, it's different.
It's not a mammal.
It's an insect, so
I believe this motion would include insects.
Yeah, Kingdom Animalia is the
does it
is the highest taxonomic, and anything that is its kingdom bacteria.
Okay,
You've got bacteria, plantae, and animalia. And animalia goes down. You're thinking of, it's been a while, Phoenix?
Impressive.
It's genus, species, genus, family,
kingdom is
something with a PH, and then kingdom.
finite.
And there's the finest that goes into Insecta, Mammalia, and Asia.
Dimitri, you had something to say?
Sorry.
Sorry, on
On this.
You got so distracted by
Yeah, no, sorry.
I was admiring the analysis. It's been a while, but yes, I thought we should consider insects in a way, because they are a big subset. I'm not sure if they're as big as mice. They probably aren't, but we do lots of malaria experiments on them.
Drosophila modelling.
And of course, yes, and that's also very important. But in terms of drawing the line, I think that's the place, that's the matter on which many people would disagree, like states do, for example. But I think great apes should be exempt, unless there is a very important need. So I would agree for the rest of the countries which have drawn that line, but when would we skip that line? If there is a pandemic which is killing fast, and the only way to model that virus, the only proven way to model that virus or that pathogen, is to model it and find a cure on one of those hosts which belongs to the greater apes, only then we could justify it and relax those
How would you prove it?
restrictions. That's a good point.
You
It's
couldn't,
much of a gamble.
Hypothetically,
you
yeah.
couldn't really. Just a question that occurred to me earlier when we were discussing the respect and ethics of animals. How do we do veterinary medicine testing? As in, is dog medicine tested on mice first?
That was one of the points I was going to bring up later, actually.
Oh.
It's really interesting. So one of the other arguments for animal testing is that animals benefit. So
Okay.
I think the Royal, I don't say anything wrong. I think the Royal College of Vets and various societies, they're all for animal testing, which is very interesting. A huge number of animal and veterinary treatments have benefited hugely from human animal testing, and also animal testing for the purpose of finding out information for the treatment of animals. Diabetes, hip replacements in dogs, for example. I suppose the counter argument to that is that if the intention of the animal testing is for the betterment of humans, and the animals, number one, don't have a choice, number two, any benefit is a secondary result of the primary intention, then you can argue that it's a side effect. You know, it's something that's come along with the treatment, with the animal testing for humans. But I think it's a very interesting question, actually, that sort of the effect on veterinary medicine.
I certainly agree, but moving on to this ethics part of it, I think it is a little bit inevitable to avoid this counter argument, because even in the case of humans, let's say after we have a drug that passes early clinical stages and moves on to clinical trials in humans, there are examples of drugs being tested in other countries, not just for having the process done in a cheaper fashion, but also the population that is used may not directly benefit from that treatment, not necessarily, or they may be given actually a treatment which is being tested when there is, in fact, another treatment already in place, and they may be deprived of that treatment. And this, I think this is recent, I don't know the exact date, but this is when the Helsinki guidelines, which protected that, changed to the good clinical practice ones to allow more leeway to the experimenters. So from this sense, the question is more of, yes, animals benefit, but when animals don't benefit, should we not experiment on them?
I intend to move on to slightly more scientific questions towards the end, but just going back to this ethical dilemma. So Tom, you mentioned the two-pronged approach. So whether they suffer, animals suffer, or whether we base the hierarchy on intelligence levels. And I believe that some of the regulatory bodies seem to adopt the second approach, because in the US, there's the US Welfare Act for animals, and that covers most animals, but it doesn't cover rats, mice, and fish, which I think we can assume are slightly less intelligent species than cats, dogs, apes. So I believe they go for that. But that's a very fine line to tread, looking at intelligence, because then this is a very tricky subject to discuss. But let's say we have a really severely disabled human. You could argue that their intelligence levels are less than the average human. So where do you draw the line?
Yeah. What does intelligence have to do with suffering?
There's two independent.
Yeah, but I mean, if the question around animal testing, and most of the argument has either been its scientific efficiency or its ethical basis. Ethical basis is mostly around suffering.
Okay.
I mean, it's treatment, it's proper treatment of other people to preserve other people or other creatures, to preserve their life and their quality of life to the best possible way. That would imply a suffering argument, not necessarily an intelligence argument. And intelligence has nothing to do with suffering.
But on the grounds of the intelligence argument, if we take this example of a disabled man or someone in coma, for example, and consider that at that point in time, he or she may be inferior in terms of intelligence to some greater apes or other forms of animals. I think we're running a very perilous path, because we should be looking at the potential or at the state of that person before they went into that coma or into that disability, or even if they were born with that disability. I think we should be looking at their potential when that is fixed, because if we view people with disabilities to be inferior in terms of intelligence to several animals, I think...
Or even babies.
Or even babies, exactly. In that case, babies their nervous system is not well developed, and they need experience in order to achieve their maximum potential. So I think that would be a totally different world, and one I wouldn't like to imagine.
So the final question that was submitted to us goes back to the central motion of the discussion. So it says, if there was a ban on all animal testing, what effect would this have on the pharmaceutical industry? Would it collapse? Would it cope? Or whatever?
Well, it depends. It depends on if the ban means that you no longer need animal testing to pass a drug, so you can go straight from in vitro to in vivo human testing. Pharma industry will be fine. It's not the pharma industry that's the one at risk. It's everybody else. It's the question of whether the fact that they're allowing, because you can get people. I mean, you get different phases of the trial, of different phase of trials have different styles. But when you're testing for safety, you have to test on healthy individuals. So you're thereby accepting the risk of testing healthy individuals with noxious chemicals, because let's be honest, I mean, the one that comes obvious to mind is cancer therapy. Cancer therapy, which is it's a cytotoxic. I mean, even anticlonal antibodies are detrimental to the health of a healthy human being. So you'd have to accept the obvious morbidity that you'd be causing, with the costs of that morbidity.
But would there be an issue with numbers? Would you have enough compliant human participants to test all the drugs, to do all the tests that you need?
So I think this is something we touched upon. It's difficult to get throughput and volume.
And also the discriminatory aspect of it, based on class and wealth and social status. I think that's a whole new ethical argument that I don't think we have time for today. But in answer to your question, I think that if animal testing was banned tomorrow, I personally think that medical advancement would grind to a halt, very slowly. It would eventually grind to a halt, and I think, it would essentially take us back not to the dark ages, but in terms of advancement. I think you mentioned thalidomide earlier. I'm not sure if I think that was one of the last drugs that wasn't tested extensively enough in animals. I don't think they tested it enough in pregnant animals. And I think if we ban animal testing tomorrow, we might see more thalidomide cases appearing, similar things.
I mean, I agree with this. It's hard to say what would happen, or suppose this ban was imposed in 1920. It's hard to say where we would be now. I mean, if it pertained at the time, maybe nobody would have seen insulin. Maybe we would have seen drugs better than insulin, because we would have been forced to find better alternatives to test on. So it's a very difficult question, but I think from what we have available, and as discussed about the alternatives in terms of research, at the moment, suppose we were to put in place a ban forthwith, this would be very difficult for the pharmaceutical companies if we don't allow them to fast track that process and skip that step. This would be, I don't want to say detrimental, but instead let's take, for example, in a recent interview, Ian Reid, Pfizer's CEO, said that he strives to make the process quicker, not necessarily easier, but he strives to make the process of a drug from laboratory to market quicker. Now, the only thing I can think, if we ban animal testing and we keep the regulations of safety as tight as they are, is that this process will get a lot longer, if not conclusive at all.
Well, you'd have to substitute animal testing with human testing, or you'd have to take away the regulatory need for animal testing, because the government couldn't ban one thing and then still have it required.
And arguably, the timelines may actually be shorter, because if you're skipping that animal study, we're testing all of the key elements of drug safety, efficacy in a human, then we're not going to be coming to a stage where, after perfect results in an animal model, when it comes to humans, we find there are side effects which are unacceptable. You're going back to the drawing board and having to revise the drug. Instead, it's streamlining the process.
Sure. You'd also be killing a lot of people in the process, but yeah, that's a good point.
More than killing, it'd be causing a lot of people with heavy morbidities that would then
Exactly.
be a weight on the government. Because that's also there's the economic standpoint where you could say animal testing costs a lot, but the alternative is, hopefully, is the assumption, is that we are preventing a lot of morbidities either through human testing or through eventually both creating drugs that then humans can use, or creating drugs that won't cause bad things in humans.
This is actually very topical, especially at a time where the economic system, speaking about the NHS, but mostly worldwide, is under huge financial stress. The last thing we would want is another factor putting stress on the system, and that being participants in failed studies because the drug wasn't safe enough, something which we have been doing for the last century. So I think we're going back, as Tom put it, the dark ages.
So I think both the industry and society may not be ready for such a seismic change, but perhaps in the future, when we're equipped with appropriate tools, it may be possible to.
So that leads nicely to the next question. Where do you see the future of this topic? Where do you think that eventually animal testing will be replaced? Do you think they will still have a place in research for many years to come? What do you think?
It's a difficult question again, because we have to speculate based on current data, and with technology, the world keeps changing so fast, so the data at our disposal keeps changing as well. Perhaps we would move into more advanced and more sophisticated 3D models, which are printed, but then again, whether we would be able to print or assemble a whole organism together, that would be very optimistic and probably a target we're quite far off at the moment. But in terms of animal research, especially for the next few years, I think that the standards will remain the same because we are developing tools. We have an extensive toolkit for analyzing animals, techniques like Crelox and even CRISPR. CRISPR is interesting because we can apply it into humans as well, but I think we will continue to develop this toolkit for the time being to increase the possibilities in the field of animal research until we reach.
I'll let the other panelists have a go at this question, but quickly before that, how could we ever replicate a systemic circulation without using animals? How would we be able to do that? How would we be able to assess a drug's effect in a systemic circulation without using animal models?
So, assuming this will be in future, because it doesn't exist now, bicentennial man. That's where we're hopefully headed, because if we're able to grow organs, which will solve a whole bunch of other issues that we don't need to go into this time, but if we're able to grow appropriate tissue-typed organs, by that logic we'd be able to grow vessels. By that logic we'd be able to link all these different organs together, and just like we have skeletons now in our anatomy, we could have 3D printed vasculature connected with organ and heart and all that. And you can imagine almost a nervous system is very similar to a computer. So if you can also wire in a nervous system to a computer that would have the pain receptors, that would have the baroreceptors, that would have the chemoreceptors, which if you can combine all of that, because I'm sure we can already make those right now with the computing that we have. if you can then make the organs and the vasculature, which I'm hoping is going to happen, I don't know, 25, 50 years maybe? You could, hypothetically, put together a decapitated human body.
But that being far from our target, I suppose, would start with a huge cost, and then until that cost decreases for that to be a commercial practice, that would take another
Oh, it would take a very long time.
a very long time.
But hopefully that is where we could head, because that would be the perfect human model.
But even then, I think I agree. It is the perfect human model, but as close to perfection as you may go, because even if you replicate all the genes and you account for mutations as much as one can, the confounding factors, let's say someone makes a systemic circulation out of me, that copy of me will not have lived the same life or have eaten the same foods, so it won't be exactly the same. Definitely medicine out of it will be much more personalized to me, but there still will be that very slight chance of a side effect which has not been picked up, and that I think is the beauty of medicine.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think another possible answer would be, in future, computer modelling, so in silico modelling of disease and drug side effects. I think at the moment, even the most sophisticated supercomputers that we have don't get close to simulating the human physiology, from what I understand. But 10 years ago, the iPhone was coming out, wasn't it, or something like that. So within that space of time, with technology develops, it's a bit exciting to see where computing is as well in 10, 20 years' time, and whether that can help.
We were talking about, we had quite a lot of focus on physiological pathologies, but when it comes to psychological, how much would that bicentennial animals be able to determine the efficacy of the drug?
But how do we determine the efficacy of psychological drugs now? I mean, you can't ask a dog if they're depressed. I mean, I wish you could. I'd love to have a conversation with my dog. It's like, are you happy? Do you like that toy or that toy?
So at the moment, that's interesting. At the moment, for example, studying depression in animal models, you use mice, and I can't remember the name of these now. I studied them last year, but the surrogate that you use is the wool of the mouse to stay alive. So you put them in a water pool, a small water pool, and then give one set of mice antidepressants and one set no antidepressants to see how. Anyway, this is a topic for a different time, but that at the moment that's where we're at. And similarly with Alzheimer's drugs, you can use mice with knocked out genes for Alzheimer's and then see how well they remember their path through a set of tunnels, for example. But it's suboptimal, isn't it? It's not the same as asking someone how they feel or what they remember.
And to finish off, let's just go back to the motion. So this House would ban animal testing and research. So in one sentence, can you please respond to that? Anyone can go first. So basically a yes or no.
No.
Just yes or no, or a sentence?
You can give a sentence.
No, as long as it is used for the right reason. But at the same time, this House would also consider reducing animal research wherever.
Not yet.
I think I know everything.
Okay. Great, perfect, great. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. That was a really interesting discussion, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope people watching on the stream enjoyed it as well, and also on the website. So I'd like to thank the panelists for attending today, bringing some great discussion and some great ideas. And I'd also like to thank the audience, and to keep a lookout for any future events from the Pharmacology Society. So we'll be advertising it through the usual means.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.
was fun.